Well, of all those demands, I think the hardest to meet will be the new paradigm, because nobody understands what he means by it. Laura, can you help us out? What's he...
something about not major parties and everybody being nice to each other. I think things seems to be the new paradigm.
That's what it is, and that's what he wants. OK, well, who really wants this the most? Now, the theory went around that maybe it's in Tony Abbott's interest to just allow Julia Gillard to try and run a minority government with a hostile Senate and watch it all fall apart.
There were people sort of advising Abbott to that end within his own coalition. I don't think that's his view. I think anyone who doesn't think Abbott, really wants the job hasn't been watching for the last 5 weeks. But I do think he's been keeping a weather eye on the possibility of another election as he handles this whole negotiation process. I think he's been thinking about what he does, not only from the point of view of what the independents will think of it, but also from the point of view of what it might mean if he ends up back at the polls pretty soon, and particularly the costings issue, I think.
The bottom line also is that from Tony Abbott's perspective, he's in a much better position, I think, to go back to the polls.
Yeah.
He's looking around and saying, well, we've just seen that what we're up against now, from this campaign we now know we're up against the Karl Marx brothers, as somebody in the Labor Party refers to them, plus a Labor leader who was diminished through the course of the campaign rather than whose position was increased. So that's going to give the coalition a lot more confidence to be saying, well, if we have to go back to the polls, so be it. So at one extreme, you've got the fact that they are going to be approaching this with a much more gung-ho attitude because they think they can go back to the polls, where Labor doesn't think that's a really good idea.
They've got everything to lose.
Exactly. And then at the other extreme, we've got that thing we were talking about earlier, which is that the Nationals are going to be putting Tony Abbott under intense pressure not to give much ground to the independents. So all of those factors suggest he goes very hard on this, tries to discredit the hung parliament in case they don't get the numbers, and does that with a confidence that if things turn out that Labor does get a minority government, they can create a bit of havoc, go back to the polls and be in a pretty good position.
A risk though for the coalition going back to to the polls sooner rather than later, is that the voters of Queensland and New South Wales have vented their spleen. The Labor voters there, they've had a huge whack at Labor. They've seen the instability that this may cause, and at a poll that comes up in the next few months, say, or 3 months or 3 to 6 months, short of the New South Wales state poll next year, they might say, righto, we've made our voices known, we'll now put them back in.
On the other hand, given the opportunity, they might say, no, we meant it.
They could say that, but there is that factor that perhaps they have done the spleen venting.
There's people in the coalition who think it would be probably in their interest for another federal poll and the New South Wales state poll to get mixed in together. That would be no bad thing from their point of view.
Yeah.
It seems then that for Labor it's a more desperate situation for Julia Gillard, because you can see the way ahead for Tony Abbott even if he stays in opposition, because short-term or medium-term he has a prospect of a real crack at it in another election.
That's right. And also I think one of the problems that she faces, and I think Tony Abbott faces, immediately and in terms of a new poll, is what happens to the Green vote. If we went back to the polls, what would happen to that huge swing to the Greens, which vastly outstripped the swing to the coalition? Would that come back to Labor for the reasons Kerry Ann's talking about? And also for Tony Abbott, if he did get minority government now, in July next year he will be facing a Greens-dominated Senate, and he won't really be able to say, look, I have got an absolutely thumping mandate here from the electorate. So, once again, that's an issue that everybody has to keep in mind.
And Wayne Swan took one issue off the table, or did he, this morning when he said that there's no talk of a Greens minister in a Labor government.
Yeah, he didn't, as far as I could tell, he didn't absolutely rule out some sort of alliance with the Greens, but he said there wouldn't be a Greens minister. I mean, I think it's kind of, in some ways, they're taking it to sort of very large extremes, what they're ruling in and not ruling in. I mean, Wayne Swan in that interview would not rule out the possibility of dismantling tariff barriers because Bob Katter thinks it's a good idea. And of course, I mean, the Labor Party could not possibly think about reversing its free trade stance. I don't know why they can't just come out and say so, even if, you know, the independents are saying something different.
They've lost the habit of coming out and saying things like that.
They should have.
Yeah.
Well, the interesting thing is Federal Cabinet had a very long strategy meeting about all of these things on Thursday, and as far as I know, the only thing that they actually ruled out was huge amounts of pork barrelling to the individual electorates of the independents. Now that's, you know, pretty basic, but it's a good sign, I suppose, for a starting point. But you know, almost everything else was basically giving a tick to Julia Gillard to do whatever she thought it would take to stay in office.
And yet you had Anthony Albanese on Friday night on Late Line trotting out what he hoped was a very appealing line to the regional independents, particularly the semi-independent in Western Australia, Mr Crook, which was about their massive regional infrastructure programs, etc., etc. So,
funded from the mining tax, Mr Crook really doesn't like.
That Mr Crook doesn't really like. So, you know, I mean, what's his position? I mean, where's he going to stand in all this? I mean, he's a fascinating character because he stands on a Nationals platform, which he's now calling himself the Independent, etc.
He couldn't support Labor while the mining tax was in place.
That's right.
Surely they're not going to walk away from the negotiated mining tax.
No, but Anthony Albanese was trying to make a very strong point that, in fact, Mr Crook had a lot more in common with them, apart from the mining tax, than he should have with the coalition.
And the Nationals then will come face-to-face with the Independents at some point this week, not in a formal sense that he talked to the Nationals, but by virtue of their portfolios. That'll be an interesting moment.
It will be an interesting moment, but I think, you know, every time we see Tony Windsor open his mouth, he's an eminently sensible kind of bloke who's, you know, been around the blocks, who knows the system and knows these people pretty well. And I found it kind of amusing this week, both of the political leaders putting on their Sunday best and their shiny shoes and pretending that they're sudden converts to multi-party democracy and kinder, gentler polities and everything. I mean, these guys have been around. They can see through that, you know, before it even started.